He smiled when he said it, standing under crystal chandeliers in Manhattan's Plaza Hotel, surrounded by cameras and champagne glasses that caught the light like diamonds. Jacob Silver laughed a practiced, comfortable laugh and gestured casually toward the elegant woman in the white gown beside him. "Oh, her. She's just my maid." The words fell from his mouth easily, almost playfully, as if they were nothing more than a harmless joke, as if the woman standing inches away, her dark skin glowing under the ballroom lights, her posture impeccable, wasn't his wife of 3 years, as if Ava Silver, patient, brilliant, quietly powerful Ava, was just another accessory he could adjust to fit the image he desperately needed people to believe. The senior managers surrounding them laughed politely. Someone raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Another sipped champagne and looked away. The discomfort was subtle, nearly invisible, but it was there, hovering in the space between social grace and moral clarity that most people prefer not to examine too closely. Ava didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't correct him, didn't let the shock or humiliation register on her face. She simply stood there, her hands folded carefully in front of her, her expression neutral, as strangers nodded and accepted the lie her husband had just told. As the room absorbed his words and moved on, cataloguing her as irrelevant, invisible, beneath notice, no one saw the way her fingers tightened slightly. No one noticed the way her breathing slowed, controlled, deliberate, because moments like this don't explode immediately. They don't announce themselves with shouting or tears or dramatic exits. They settle quietly into the bones of a relationship, into the foundation of trust that holds two people together. And they wait. They wait until the perfect moment. Minutes later, the double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened with a subtle flourish. Conversations began to taper off. Phones lifted. A hush spread through the crowd like a wave moving toward shore, and Jacob Silver, still riding the high of having successfully navigated what he believed was his most important social test, yet turned toward the stage with eager anticipation. The CEO of Hawthorne Global was about to speak. Jacob clapped enthusiastically, his hands coming together with the kind of energy that suggested he believed applause alone could secure his promotion. He glanced around, making sure the right people saw him, making sure his face radiated loyalty, ambition, respect. He didn't notice that Ava had stopped looking at the stage. He didn't notice that several people in the room were now looking at him differently, not with admiration, but with something closer to pity. Because the woman he had just erased, the woman he had reduced to nothing more than hired help in front of the most powerful people in his professional world, was about to be introduced in a way that would make his humiliation not just public, but permanent. This is not a story about a man being embarrassed at a party. It's a story about how easily insecurity curdles into cruelty, about how people don't reveal their true character when they're angry, but when they think they're safe, when they believe no consequences are waiting in the shadows, about how ambition without integrity doesn't elevate, it corrodes. And it's about what happens when the person you tried to make invisible steps fully, undeniably, into the light. Jacob Silver learned the rules early. Growing up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, he watched his mother work double shifts at the medical center, while his father cycled through construction gigs that never quite lasted. There was never enough, not enough space, not enough money, not enough certainty about whether next month's rent would come together without another tense conversation around the kitchen table. But what Jacob noticed most wasn't the lack of money. It was the way people treated his family when they knew. When his mother showed up to parent-teacher conferences in her scrubs, still smelling faintly of antiseptic, teachers spoke to her differently than they spoke to the mothers who arrived in tailored blazers. When his father picked him up from school in the battered pickup truck with the dented fender, other kids made jokes Jacob pretended not to hear. When Jacob wore the same sneakers for 2 years straight because they still fit, people noticed. And when people noticed, they made assumptions. By the time Jacob was 12, he understood a fundamental truth that would shape the rest of his life. Perception was currency. People who looked successful were treated as if they mattered more. People who looked poor were dismissed before they even opened their mouths. So Jacob made a decision. He would learn to look like he belonged. In high school, He took every AP class available, not because he loved learning, but because AP student sounded better than kid from the East Side. He joined the debate team because it was free and made him seem articulate. He volunteered at the public library on weekends because it looked good on college applications, and because the librarian, Mrs. Howell, sometimes brought in pastries she couldn't finish at home. Jacob didn't have money, but he had discipline. And discipline, he learned, could be mistaken for confidence. When he earned a partial scholarship to Cleveland State University, his parents celebrated with pizza from the place that always gave them extra napkins and watered-down soda. Jacob smiled and thanked them, but privately, he felt the same gnawing frustration he'd felt his entire childhood. It wasn't enough. Cleveland State was fine, respectable even, but it wasn't prestigious. It wouldn't open the doors he needed opened, so he worked harder. He graduated summa cum laude, spent a year working 60-hour weeks at a mid-tier consulting firm in Columbus, and saved every dollar he didn't absolutely need to spend. He studied for the GMAT like his life depended on it because, in a way, it did, and applied to business schools with the kind of single-minded focus that left no room for doubt. When he got into the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, he felt, for the first time in his life, like he had won something that mattered. At Booth, Jacob transformed. He bought better clothes used, but tailored to fit. He practiced the way successful people spoke, crisp, confident, never apologizing for taking up space. He studied his classmates the way an anthropologist might study a foreign culture, cataloging the small signals that marked someone as belonging, where they vacationed, what brands they mentioned casually, how they talked about their families without ever sounding desperate or needy. Jacob became fluent in the language of success. But fluency isn't the same as authenticity. Beneath the polished surface, beneath the firm handshake and the easy laugh and the carefully curated LinkedIn profile, Jacob was still the kid from Cleveland who believed that if people knew the truth, if they knew how hard he was working to seem effortless, they'd see through him. They'd dismiss him the way people had always dismissed his family, so he never let them see. By the time he finished his MBA and landed a position at Hawthorne Global, a multinational consulting firm with offices in New York, London, and Singapore, Jacob had mastered the performance. He knew how to network, how to position himself in meetings, how to make senior partners remember his name. But he also knew, deep down, that he was always one mistake away from being exposed, and that fear never left him. Ava Monroe, later Ava Silver, grew up with a different set of rules. Her childhood in the South Side of Chicago wasn't easy, but it was rooted in something Jacob had never experienced, the certainty that she was enough, exactly as she was. Her mother, a social worker, taught her that dignity wasn't something you earned by impressing people. It was something you carried inside yourself, regardless of whether anyone noticed. Her father, a high school history teacher, taught her that real power didn't come from being the loudest voice in the room. It came from knowing what you stood for and refusing to compromise it. Ava learned early that competence spoke for itself. She didn't need to perform. She didn't need to prove herself in every conversation or remind people of her accomplishments. She simply did the work, trusted that quality would be recognized eventually, and moved through the world with a calm assurance that others often mistook for simplicity. People underestimated Ava constantly, and she let them, because Ava understood something Jacob never did. Underestimation was often an advantage. While her classmates at Northwestern University jockeyed for attention, Ava quietly excelled. She double-majored in political science and economics, graduated near the top of her class, and earned a full scholarship to Yale Law School. She didn't talk about it unless someone asked, and even then, she downplayed it, saying things like, "I got lucky with timing," or "The scholarship committee was generous that year." It wasn't false modesty. Ava genuinely didn't need external validation. At Yale, she focused on corporate law and social justice, drawn to the intersection of business and ethics. She spent her summers interning at non-profits and legal aid clinics, working with people who had been harmed by corporate negligence, by exploitative labor practices, by systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It was meaningful work, but it didn't pay. So after law school, Ava made a pragmatic choice. She joined a corporate law firm in Chicago, one that specialized in compliance and regulatory work for multinational corporations. The salary was excellent, the work was intellectually rigorous, and while it wasn't the frontline advocacy she'd imagined doing, it allowed her to understand how power actually operated, not in courtrooms, but in boardrooms. She learned how decisions were made, how language was weaponized, how companies protected themselves through carefully constructed legal frameworks. She became an expert in corporate governance, in risk management, in the quiet, unglamorous work of ensuring that businesses operated within ethical boundaries. And she was exceptional at it. But Ava never advertised her success. She didn't post about her cases on social media. She didn't name-drop clients at parties. She didn't network aggressively or position herself for recognition. She just did the work, which is why, when she met Jacob Silver at a community legal clinic in Chicago 5 years ago, he had no idea who she was. The clinic was located in a converted storefront in Pilsen, a neighborhood Jacob had driven through exactly once before and had mentally catalogued as rough. He'd signed up to volunteer because his mentor at Booth had suggested it would look good, and because Jacob believed every experience was an opportunity to build his personal brand. Ava had been volunteering there for 2 years. She worked evenings after her firm job, helping low-income families navigate landlord disputes, wage theft claims, and immigration paperwork. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because it mattered. Jacob noticed her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. While other volunteers made a point of introducing themselves to everyone in the room, of asking questions loudly enough to be overheard, Ava sat quietly in the corner, reviewing a case file with the kind of focus that suggested she'd forgotten anyone else was there. He introduced himself. She smiled politely, shook his hand, and went back to her work. Over the following weeks, Jacob found himself watching her. She was beautiful in an understated way, dark skin that seemed to glow under the clinic's fluorescent lights, natural hair pulled back in a low bun, minimal makeup, clothing that was professional but never flashy. She moved through the space with a quiet confidence that Jacob found both intriguing and slightly intimidating. But what struck him most was how people responded to her. Clients relaxed around Ava in a way they didn't around other volunteers. She listened without interrupting, asked questions without judgment, and explained complex legal concepts in language that made sense. She never rushed anyone, never made them feel stupid for not understanding, never treated their problems as trivial. Jacob, by contrast, struggled. He found the work frustrating, too slow, too messy, too emotionally draining. He wanted clear problems with clear solutions, not complicated family dynamics and systemic injustices that couldn't be fixed with a well-crafted argument. After 6 weeks, he was ready to quit. But then Ava invited him to get coffee. They went to a small cafe near the clinic, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that Jacob would normally have dismissed as trying too hard. Ava ordered black coffee. Jacob ordered something with almond milk and 3 adjectives. "You're not enjoying the clinic," Ava said. It wasn't a question. Jacob considered lying, then decided honesty might be more impressive. "It's harder than I expected, because the problems don't have neat solutions." "Exactly." He leaned back, grateful she understood. "I'm used to structured problems, cases with clear parameters. This feels endless." Ava nodded slowly, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "That's because it is endless. Systemic injustice doesn't get solved by one person helping one family. It's exhausting if you approach it like it's a project you can complete. Then why do you keep doing it?" She looked at him for a long moment, and Jacob had the uncomfortable sense that she was seeing something in him he hadn't intended to reveal. "Because the work matters," she said simply. "Not because it's going to fix everything, but because it matters to the person sitting across from you. That's enough." Jacob didn't understand it then, but he was drawn to it, to her calm certainty, to the way she seemed immune to the anxieties that plagued him constantly, to the way she existed without needing to prove anything. He started asking her out for coffee more often, then dinner, Then weekend walks along the lakeshore, where Ava would talk about the cases she was working on, and Jacob would talk about his ambitions at Hawthorne Global. She never tried to impress him. She never performed, and Jacob mistook that for simplicity. He thought Ava was kind, thoughtful, maybe a little naive, a good person, certainly, but not particularly ambitious, not driven, not someone who would complicate his carefully constructed image of success. He had no idea that Ava Monroe was already one of the most respected corporate attorneys in Chicago. He had no idea that the small cases she mentioned casually involved multi-million-dollar corporations. He had no idea that she had been offered partnerships at 3 different firms and had turned them all down because she was waiting for the right opportunity, one that aligned with her values, not just her bank account. He didn't know because he never asked, and Ava never told him because she didn't think it mattered. What mattered, she thought, was whether they respected each other, whether they could build something real. She believed Jacob saw her. She was wrong. The invitation arrived in September, embossed on heavy cardstock that felt expensive between Jacob's fingers. Hawthorne Global cordially invites you to the annual Leadership Gala, the Plaza Hotel, New York City. Black tie. Jacob read it 3 times, his heart rate increasing with each pass. This was it. This was the moment he'd been working toward for years. The gala wasn't just a party, it was a proving ground. Senior partners would be there. The CEO, Richard Hawthorne himself, would be there. Promotions were often announced in the weeks following the event, and everyone knew the gala was where you demonstrated you belonged at the next level. Jacob had been at Hawthorne Global for 4 years. He'd worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificed weekends, traveled to client sites across 3 continents, and absorbed every piece of feedback like it was sacred text. He'd done everything right, but he'd also seen colleagues plateau. He'd watched people get passed over for promotions despite doing excellent work, and he'd noticed a pattern. The people who advanced weren't just competent. They fit. They had the right image, the right social polish, the right kind of personal life that signaled stability and success. Jacob looked at the invitation again. +1 invited. He thought about Ava, kind, thoughtful Ava, who still volunteered at the legal clinic, who preferred quiet dinners at home to fancy restaurants, who wore simple dresses and minimal jewelry, and never seemed concerned with how she appeared to others. And for the first time since they'd married 2 years ago, Jacob wondered if that was a problem. "I got invited to the gala," Jacob said that evening, setting the invitation on their kitchen counter. Ava was making dinner, something simple, as always, pasta with vegetables, and she glanced over with a warm smile. "That's wonderful. You've been hoping for this." "I have." Jacob hesitated. "You're invited too. It's black tie." "Okay." Ava stirred the pasta, unbothered. "When is it?" "October 19th. Saturday. I'll make sure I'm free." Jacob watched her move around their small kitchen in their modest apartment in Brooklyn. They'd moved to New York when Jacob got promoted to senior consultant, and while the apartment was expensive by normal standards, it was tiny by Manhattan standards, barely 900 square feet, with a kitchen that couldn't fit more than 2 people comfortably. Ava had never complained. She seemed content with their life, her work, their neighborhood, the small routines they'd built together. But Jacob had started noticing things. He noticed that Ava's clothes, while professional, weren't designer. He noticed that she didn't wear expensive jewelry, didn't carry a luxury handbag, didn't seem to care about brands at all. He noticed that when they went to firm events, Ava was polite but quiet, never working the room the way other spouses did. And he noticed that people sometimes seemed confused when he introduced her, as if they were trying to figure out how she fit into his narrative of success. "This event is important," Jacob said carefully. "A lot of the senior leadership will be there." "I understand. I mean really important. Career-defining, probably." Ava turned off the stove and looked at him fully. "Jacob, I know. I'll be there. I'll dress appropriately. You don't need to worry." But Jacob was worried, because the truth was, he'd started imagining a different kind of life, one where his wife was someone whose presence at events like this enhanced his image, rather than requiring him to explain her, someone who understood corporate culture instinctively, who networked effortlessly, who looked the part. Someone, if he was honest with himself, who came from the world he was trying to join rather than the world he was trying to leave behind. He didn't say any of that, of course. Instead, he said, "Just let me handle the conversations, okay? These people can be particular about how things are discussed." Ava's expression shifted slightly, something Jacob couldn't quite read. Particular how? Just corporate. You know, lots of unspoken rules. I'm familiar with corporate culture, Jacob. I know you are. I just mean, he trailed off, aware he was digging himself deeper but unable to stop. I'll introduce you. I'll make sure people know who you are. Just follow my lead. Ava was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. Okay. She served dinner. They ate. They talked about other things. But something had shifted. In the weeks leading up to the gala, Jacob's anxiety intensified. He bought a new tuxedo, expensive, tailored perfectly. He got a haircut at a high-end barber in Manhattan. He researched everyone who would be attending, memorizing names and titles and recent accomplishments so he could reference them naturally in conversation. He also started making small comments to Ava. You might want to get your hair done professionally for the gala. Maybe something a little more formal than your usual style. These events are very visual, lots of photos. Ava listened to each suggestion without argument. But Jacob noticed she also didn't change anything. She scheduled a hair appointment, but went to her regular stylist in Brooklyn. She bought a new dress, but chose something elegant and understated, rather than the dramatic, attention-grabbing style Jacob had vaguely hoped for. When he saw the dress, a simple white gown with clean lines and minimal embellishment, he felt a pang of disappointment he couldn't quite articulate. "It's beautiful," he said. "Because it was." "Thank you," Ava replied. But it wasn't what he'd imagined. The night before the gala, Jacob couldn't sleep. He lay beside Ava in their dark bedroom, listening to the muted sounds of Brooklyn traffic outside their window, and felt the weight of everything he'd worked for pressing down on his chest. This was his chance, if he played it right, if he made the right impressions, if he demonstrated that he belonged not just professionally, but socially. He could finally step into the life he'd been chasing since childhood. But if he messed it up, if people saw him as an outsider, as someone who didn't quite fit, as someone still trying too hard, everything could stall. He could spend years stuck at his current level, watching less capable people move past him, simply because they had the right background, the right connections, the right image. Jacob turned over, staring at Ava's sleeping form beside him. She was a good person, a kind person, but kindness wasn't currency at events like this, and Jacob had already decided nothing was going to stop him from making this night perfect. The Plaza Hotel rose above Fifth Avenue, like a monument to a certain kind of American ambition. Grand, gilded, unapologetically expensive. Jacob had walked past it dozens of times during his years in New York, but he'd never been inside. Now, stepping through the doors with Ava beside him, he felt a surge of validation so powerful, it was almost painful. This was the life he was supposed to have. The ballroom was even more spectacular than Jacob had imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, casting warm light across tables draped in ivory linens. Floral arrangements exploded with white roses and orchids. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per piece than Jacob's childhood dinners. And everywhere were people who mattered. Jacob recognized senior partners from Hawthorne Global's offices across the country. He saw clients whose companies had been featured in Forbes. He spotted the regional vice president who controlled promotions for the Northeast Division. His chest tightened with possibility. "It's beautiful," Ava said quietly beside him. Jacob barely heard her. He was too busy scanning the room, calculating his approach, deciding who to talk to first. He'd rehearsed this. He knew exactly how to position himself, confident but not arrogant, accomplished but still hungry, polished but relatable. He just needed to execute. "Let's get a drink," he said, guiding Ava toward the bar. As they moved through the crowd, Jacob noticed people glancing at him in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, at Ava in her elegant white gown. She looked stunning, he had to admit. The dress hugged her figure with a quiet sophistication that made her stand out without trying to. Her hair was styled in a low bun that showcased her graceful neck and the simple diamond earrings she wore. But Jacob also noticed the way some people's eyes lingered on Ava, then flicked to him, then back to her, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle. And that made him nervous. At the bar, Jacob ordered a scotch he didn't particularly like, but knew was expensive. Ava ordered white wine. They turned back toward the room, and within seconds, Jacob spotted his opportunity. Marcus Reynolds, a senior partner who'd mentored him briefly during his second year, was standing 20 feet away, talking to a small group of people Jacob didn't recognize. "That's Marcus Reynolds," Jacob said quietly to Ava. "I need to talk to him." "Okay. Just let me handle the conversation." Ava gave him a look he couldn't quite interpret, but she nodded. Jacob approached with his most confident smile. "Marcus, good to see you." Marcus turned, his face breaking into a professional smile of recognition. "Jacob, how are you? Good to see you here. Wouldn't miss it." Jacob shook his hand firmly. "Big night." "Indeed it is." Marcus's eyes shifted to Ava. "And who's this?" This was the moment. Jacob had planned this introduction a dozen different ways, rehearsed variations in his head during the car ride to Manhattan. He could introduce her as his wife, simple, straightforward, accurate. He could mention her legal background, her work in Chicago, the fact that she was accomplished in her own right. But standing there, in the Plaza Ballroom, surrounded by the most important people in his professional world, Jacob felt the old panic rising, because Ava, for all her grace and intelligence, didn't fit the image of the spouse he thought he needed. She wasn't from this world. She didn't have the right background, the right connections, the right performance of success that corporate culture demanded. And if people knew she was his wife, if they started asking questions about what she did, where she came from, they might start asking similar questions about him. So Jacob made a choice. He smiled, gestured casually toward Ava, and said the words that would destroy everything. "Oh, her. She helps out at home. Basically my maid." He laughed when he said it, a light, dismissive laugh, meant to signal that she wasn't important, that this wasn't a topic worth exploring. The group laughed politely in response. Ava didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her face composed, her hands folded in front of her, as the room absorbed Jacob's lie and moved on. Marcus glanced at her briefly, nodded, then turned his attention back to Jacob. "Well, the firm certainly keeps us all busy enough to need the help. How are things in the Northeast Division?" And just like that, the conversation shifted. Jacob felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. It had worked. He'd deflected attention away from Ava, protected his image, and kept the conversation focused on professional matters. He glanced at Ava once, just once, to make sure she was okay. She was still standing there, composed, expressionless. He felt a small twinge of guilt, but he pushed it aside. She'd understand. This was important. This was his career. She'd understand later, when they got home, when he could explain that sometimes you had to make strategic decisions in moments like this. For now, he turned his full attention back to Marcus Reynolds and the conversation that might determine his future. Behind him, Ava remained silent, invisible, exactly as he'd intended. The lie spread with the casual efficiency of gossip at a corporate event. Jacob didn't introduce Ava again after that first encounter, which meant other people did, and when they did, they repeated what they'd heard. "Oh, that's Jacob Silver's maid." Some people accepted it without question. Others seemed briefly confused. Why would someone bring their housekeeper to a formal gala? But didn't press the issue. A few people gave Ava sympathetic looks, as if acknowledging some universal understanding about service work and the awkwardness of being brought to an employer's social event. No one questioned Jacob directly, and Jacob, emboldened by how easily the lie had been accepted, moved through the evening with increasing confidence. He networked aggressively, positioning himself in conversations with the right people, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, demonstrating his knowledge of industry trends and company politics. He mentioned recent projects he'd led, dropped the names of important clients, and made sure everyone knew he was ready for more responsibility. It was the best networking he'd ever done. He felt powerful. For the first time in his life, Jacob Silver felt like he belonged in a room like this. Not as someone faking it, not as someone working twice as hard to keep up, but as someone who deserved to be here, and all it had cost him was his wife's dignity. Ava stood near a column at the edge of the ballroom, holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. She watched Jacob work the room. She watched him laugh and gesture and lean in close to senior partners, performing the role he'd been rehearsing for years. She watched him shine in a way she'd never seen before, confident, charismatic, completely in his element, and she felt something inside her quietly break, not dramatically, not with tears or rage or any visible emotion, just a clean, precise break, like a bone fracturing along a fault line that had been weakening for months. Ava understood, intellectually, why Jacob had done what he'd done. She understood his insecurity, his desperation to belong, his belief that perception mattered more than truth. She'd watched him struggle with those things throughout their relationship, had tried to reassure him that he didn't need to perform for her, that he was enough as he was. But she'd never imagined he would sacrifice her to protect his image. She'd never imagined he would stand in a room full of strangers and erase her existence. And what hurt most, more than the lie itself, more than the humiliation of standing there while people looked through her, was the realization that Jacob genuinely believed this was acceptable. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He simply didn't see her as someone whose dignity mattered as much as his ambition. Ava set down her wine glass and glanced toward the exit. She could leave. She could walk out of the Plaza Hotel, get a cab back to Brooklyn, and be gone before Jacob even noticed. Part of her wanted to do exactly that. But another part, the part that had been trained in strategy, in patience, in playing the long game, knew that leaving now would be a mistake, because this night wasn't over yet. And Ava had a feeling that the universe or karma, or simple poetic justice, was about to reveal truths that Jacob wasn't prepared to face. So she stayed. She stood near the column, invisible to everyone except the few waiters who occasionally asked if she needed anything. And she waited. At 8:30, the lights dimmed slightly, and a voice came over the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will begin shortly." Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the moment when the CEO would speak, when important announcements would be made, when the people who mattered would be recognized. He quickly found his assigned table and sat down, gesturing for Ava to sit beside him. She did, silently. Jacob didn't notice her expression. He was too focused on the stage at the far end of the ballroom, where a podium had been set up and a microphone was being adjusted. The room settled into expectant quiet. Then Richard Hawthorne stepped onto the stage, a tall, silver-haired man in his early 60s, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Jacob's monthly rent. He smiled at the crowd, and the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Jacob clapped hard, making sure people saw his enthusiasm. "Good evening," Richard Hawthorne said, his voice warm and commanding. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This gala is one of my favorite events of the year, a chance to celebrate not just our company's success, but the incredible people who make it possible." More applause. "As many of you know," Hawthorne continued, "Hawthorne Global has been going through a significant transformation. We've been rethinking our approach to corporate governance, to ethical leadership, to ensuring that our business practices align with our stated values. It's challenging work, and it requires people who are not only brilliant, but who have the moral clarity to ask the hard questions." Jacob leaned forward slightly, his mind racing. Was this about the new compliance initiative? He'd heard rumors that the company was hiring externally for a senior ethics position. "Tonight," Hawthorne said, "I'm thrilled to announce that Hawthorne Global has brought on a new Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, someone whose work I've admired for years, whose reputation in corporate law is unparalleled, and whose commitment to justice and integrity represents exactly the kind of leadership we need." Jacob felt his heart pounding. This was huge. Whoever got this position would have enormous influence, a direct line to the CEO, and a seat at every major strategic decision. "Please join me," Hawthorne said, gesturing toward the wings of the stage. in welcoming our new Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, Ava Silver. The room exploded in applause. Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. No, that wasn't. Ava stood up from the seat beside him. She walked calmly toward the stage, her white gown catching the light, her posture impeccable, her expression serene. Jacob's mind went blank. People were turning to look at him not with admiration, not with respect, but with something between shock and pity. Because the woman he had just introduced as his maid, the woman he had dismissed, erased, reduced to nothing, in front of the most important people in his professional world, was walking onto the stage to accept one of the most powerful positions in the company. And everyone in the ballroom now knew exactly what Jacob Silver had done. Ava reached the stage with the same quiet grace she brought to everything she did. She shook Richard Hawthorne's hand, accepted the microphone he offered, and turned to face the room. Her expression was calm, professional, and completely unreadable. If she was angry, if she was hurt, if she was savoring this moment of vindication, none of it showed. She simply looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. "Thank you," Ava said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm honored to join Hawthorne Global in this capacity, and I'm looking forward to the work ahead." The applause continued, but Ava raised a hand slightly to quiet it. "Before I say anything else," she continued, "I want to acknowledge that this role exists because Hawthorne Global recognizes something important, that success without integrity is just well-dressed corruption, that companies have responsibilities beyond profit, that how we treat people, especially people with less power, reveals who we truly are." Jacob couldn't breathe. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't addressing him directly, but every word felt like it was aimed at the center of his chest. "Over the past decade," Ava said, "I've worked with corporations across multiple industries, helping them build cultures of accountability and respect. And I've learned that the biggest ethical failures rarely come from malice. They come from people who convince themselves that the ends justify the means, that image matters more than truth, that other people's dignity is negotiable if it serves their ambition." The room was silent now. "That stops here," Ava said firmly. "At Hawthorne Global, we're committed to creating a culture where every person, regardless of their title, their background, or their relationship to power, is treated with basic human respect, where integrity isn't just a buzzword in our mission statement, but a daily practice, where people are valued for who they actually are, not for how useful they are to someone else's career." She paused, and for the briefest moment, her eyes found Jacob's across the ballroom. "Thank you," she said simply. The applause was thunderous. Richard Hawthorne returned to the microphone, beaming with pride, and launched into additional remarks about the company's strategic vision and the importance of ethical leadership. But Jacob didn't hear any of it. He was drowning. The noise of the room, the applause, the conversations resuming at nearby tables, the clinking of glasses and silverware, all of it blurred into a dull roar that seemed to come from very far away. Jacob's hands were shaking. His face felt hot. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how he could have been so catastrophically wrong. Ava was the new Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. Ava, his wife, the woman he'd met at a legal clinic, the woman he'd thought was sweet but not particularly ambitious, had just been introduced as one of the most powerful people at Hawthorne Global, which meant she'd been negotiating this position for weeks, maybe months, which meant she'd known she was coming to this gala as a senior executive, not as Jacob's spouse, which meant she'd heard him introduce her as his maid, had stood there while he erased her, had absorbed the humiliation, and had said nothing, because she'd known this moment was coming. Jacob felt his stomach turn. Around him, people were whispering. He caught fragments of conversations. Didn't know that was his wife. Called her his maid. Can you believe? So embarrassing. Wonder if HR knows. Jacob's phone buzzed in his pocket. Then again, then continuously. A cascade of notifications he didn't need to check to understand. People were texting, messaging, probably already posting about this on internal company channels. By tomorrow morning, everyone at Hawthorne Global would know what he'd done. By Monday, It would be a case study in how not to behave at corporate events. His career, the career he'd sacrificed everything to build, was effectively over. When the program ended and people began moving toward the reception area for more drinks and dessert, Jacob remained frozen in his seat. He couldn't move, couldn't process, couldn't figure out what to do next. Should he go to Ava? Should he apologize publicly? Should he leave? He was vaguely aware of people looking at him as they passed, some with sympathy, some with barely concealed judgment, some with the kind of fascinated horror people reserve for witnessing someone's complete public humiliation. No one stopped to talk to him. Marcus Reynolds walked past his table without making eye contact. The regional vice president Jacob had been hoping to impress moved to the opposite side of the room. Even the waiters seemed to avoid his section of the ballroom. Jacob was invisible, now truly invisible, in a way Ava had never been, because Ava's invisibility tonight had been imposed by him, a temporary erasure that she could step out of at any moment. Jacob's invisibility was different. It was the kind that came from being seen clearly and rejected completely. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, Ava appeared beside him. She didn't sit down. She just stood there, looking at him with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was disappointment, mixed with profound sadness. "We should go," she said quietly. Jacob nodded numbly and stood up. They left the Plaza Hotel in silence, walking through the grand lobby and out onto Fifth Avenue, where the November air was cold and sharp. Jacob's mind kept replaying the moment the CEO's words, the applause, the way Ava had walked onto that stage like she'd always belonged there. Because she had always belonged there. She'd never been small or simple or in need of his protection. He'd just been too insecure to see her clearly. They got a cab back to Brooklyn without speaking. The drive took 40 minutes, though it felt longer. Jacob stared out the window at the lights of Manhattan, giving way to the darker, quieter streets of their neighborhood, and he felt everything he'd worked for slipping away. When they got home, Ava went directly to their bedroom and closed the door. Jacob stood in the living room, still in his tuxedo, and felt the full weight of what he'd done finally settle over him. He had humiliated his wife in front of hundreds of people. He had prioritized his image over her dignity. He had revealed, in the clearest possible way, that he valued his career more than her humanity. And now he was going to lose both. Jacob didn't sleep. He sat in the living room until the sky began to lighten, still wearing his tuxedo, his mind cycling through the same impossible questions. How did I not know? How did I miss all the signs? How could I have been so blind? But beneath those questions was a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. He hadn't missed the signs. He'd ignored them. He'd ignored the way Ava sometimes took calls in their bedroom with the door closed, speaking in the professional tone she reserved for work. He'd ignored the way she occasionally traveled to other cities for consultations she never elaborated on. He'd ignored the fact that her work as a corporate attorney at a mid-level firm in Chicago didn't fully explain the expensive law review subscriptions that arrived at their apartment, or the invitations to speak at conferences she always declined. He'd ignored all of it because it was easier to believe Ava was simple, uncomplicated, content with being his supportive wife while he pursued his ambitions. He'd needed her to be smaller than she was, and she'd let him believe it, right up until the moment she didn't. Around 7 in the morning, Ava emerged from the bedroom wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back, her face free of makeup. She looked tired but composed. "We need to talk," she said. Jacob nodded. His throat felt tight. "I know." They sat down at their small kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten countless dinners, where they'd planned their move to New York, where they'd talked about their future like it was something solid and certain. Ava folded her hands on the table and looked at him directly. "I'm going to stay with my sister in Philadelphia for a few days," she said. "I need space to think, and you need to figure out what you actually want from this marriage." "Ava," Jacob started, but she held up a hand. "I'm not divorcing you. Not yet. But I'm not pretending last night didn't happen either. I'm so sorry." "I know you are." Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "But apologies don't mean anything if you don't understand what you're apologizing for. Do you?" Jacob opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to say yes. Wanted to convince her he understood. Wanted to fix this immediately. But Ava's expression told him she would see through any easy answer. "I was insecure," he said finally. I thought I needed to present a certain image to succeed. And I was afraid that if people knew too much about you, about us, they'd see through me. They'd realize I don't really belong in rooms like that. So you erased me." "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did, Jacob." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes were harder now. "You made a conscious choice to introduce me as your maid because you thought it protected your image. You decided my dignity was worth less than your comfort. And the worst part is, you thought I wouldn't notice, or that if I did, I'd just accept it because I loved you." Jacob felt tears burning behind his eyes. I know I did that. And I'm God. Ava, I'm so sorry. I was so wrong. You were." She was quiet for a moment. "But what scares me more than what you said is why you said it. Because it means you never really saw me, Jacob. Not as I actually am. You saw a version of me that fit your narrative, kind, supportive, uncomplicated. Someone who wouldn't challenge you or outshine you or complicate your path to success. That's not— It is." Ava's voice was gentle now, which somehow made it worse. "And I let you see me that way because I thought it didn't matter. I thought as long as we loved each other, as long as we respected each other in private, the rest was just details. But respect in private doesn't mean anything if it evaporates the moment you're in public." Jacob couldn't argue with that, couldn't defend himself, because she was right. "I never wanted to compete with you," Ava continued. "I never needed you to celebrate my accomplishments or brag about my career. I just needed you to see me as your equal. And you didn't. I do see you? No, Jacob. You see me now, because I was publicly recognized in a way you couldn't ignore. But if that announcement hadn't happened, if Richard Hawthorne hadn't put me on that stage, you'd still think of me as the sweet woman from the legal clinic who was lucky to be married to you." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow because they were true. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Tell me how to fix this." Ava looked at him for a long moment, and Jacob saw something in her expression he'd never seen before. Exhaustion, not physical tiredness, but the deep weariness that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. "I don't know if you can fix it," she said softly. "I don't know if I want you to try, because fixing it would mean fundamentally changing who you are, Jacob. It would mean confronting the insecurity that makes you treat people as props in your story. It would mean valuing integrity more than image, and I'm not sure you're capable of that." "I am. I swear I am." "Then prove it." Ava stood up. "Not to me, to yourself. Figure out who you want to be, not who you think you need to be to succeed, but who you actually want to be as a person. And then we'll talk." She went back to the bedroom and emerged a few minutes later with an overnight bag already packed. "Ava, please, I'll call you in a few days," she said. She kissed his cheek, a gesture that felt more like goodbye than affection, and walked out the door. Jacob sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she left, staring at the space where she'd been, trying to understand how he'd managed to destroy the best thing in his life in a single evening. The fallout at work began on Monday morning. Jacob arrived at Hawthorne Global's Manhattan office, expecting whispers and awkward glances, and that's exactly what he got. People who usually greeted him in the elevator suddenly became very interested in their phones. Colleagues who'd been friendly on Friday afternoon now had urgent meetings to get to. By 10 a.m., Jacob was summoned to HR. The meeting was professional but devastating. The HR director, a woman named Patricia, whom Jacob had always found pleasant, sat across from him with a folder and an expression that suggested she was about to perform an unpleasant but necessary task. "Jacob, we need to discuss your behavior at the gala." "I know," Jacob said quickly. "I know what I did was inappropriate, and I'm deeply sorry." "Sorry isn't really the issue here." Patricia opened the folder. "The issue is that you publicly humiliated a senior executive who happens to be your wife at a company event, in front of clients, partners, and the CEO himself. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. It was more than a mistake, Jacob. It was a choice, and it raises serious questions about your judgment, your character, and your ability to represent Hawthorne Global professionally. Jacob felt his stomach drop. What are you saying? I'm saying that we're placing you on a performance improvement plan, effective immediately. You'll be removed from client-facing work for the next 90 days. You'll meet with a professional conduct advisor weekly, and you'll complete mandatory training on workplace respect and ethical behavior. A performance improvement plan. Jacob knew what that meant. It was the corporate equivalent of being put on notice. Most people who were placed on PIPs either quit or were fired within 6 months. And if I complete the plan successfully, he asked, though he already knew the answer, then we'll reassess. Patricia's tone suggested that reassessment was unlikely to be favorable. But I'll be honest with you, Jacob. What you did has damaged your reputation significantly. The partners are aware. Your colleagues are aware. And Miss Silver, who is now in a senior leadership position, is aware. Even if you complete this plan, rebuilding trust will be difficult. Jacob nodded mechanically. One more thing, Patricia said. Miss Silver has requested that you have no professional interaction with her moving forward. All communication related to ethics and compliance matters will go through other channels. Do you understand? Yes. Good. Patricia closed the folder. We'll meet again next Monday to review your progress. In the meantime, I suggest you use this time to reflect seriously on your values and priorities. Jacob left the HR office, feeling like he was moving through water, everything slow and heavy and wrong. His career was over. Maybe not officially. Not yet. But effectively. No one would trust him with important work. No one would want him on their team. He'd become the guy who humiliated his wife at a company gala, and that story would follow him forever. He returned to his desk and opened his laptop, but he couldn't focus. Every email felt pointless. Every task felt meaningless. Because Ava was right. He'd built his entire life around chasing an image of success that required him to diminish other people. And now that the image had shattered, he had nothing left. Ava returned from Philadelphia 5 days later. She called first, asking if Jacob would be home that evening, and if they could talk. Her tone was neutral, professional, the same tone she might use with a colleague she didn't particularly like, but had to work with anyway. Jacob spent the entire day preparing for the conversation. He cleaned the apartment. He bought flowers, then threw them away because they felt performative. He rehearsed what he wanted to say, then abandoned the script because he knew Ava would see through it. When she arrived, she looked different. Not physically, she was still beautiful, still composed, but there was a distance in her eyes that Jacob had never seen before. She looked at him the way you'd look at a stranger you were meeting for the first time and weren't sure you wanted to know. They sat in the living room. Ava chose the chair across from the couch, maintaining space between them. "How was Philadelphia?" Jacob asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded like small talk, like they were acquaintances catching up. "It was good. I needed the distance." Ava folded her hands in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened, about whether this marriage can be saved." Jacob's heart clenched. "Can it? I don't know yet." She was quiet for a moment. "I need you to understand something, Jacob. What hurt me wasn't just the humiliation. It was the realization that you don't actually respect me. You love me, I believe that. But love without respect is just attachment, possession. It's not partnership. I do respect you. You respect my accomplishments now," Ava interrupted gently, "now that they've been publicly validated. But you didn't respect me before that moment. You saw me as less than you, as someone whose role was to support your ambitions without having significant ambitions of my own. And when my existence threatened your image, you erased me without hesitation." Jacob wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but he couldn't, because everything she was saying was true. "You're right," he said finally. His voice was hoarse. "I didn't respect you the way you deserved. I was so focused on managing perception that I stopped seeing you as a person with your own dignity, your own accomplishments, your own life separate from mine. And I'm God. Ava, I'm so sorry. I know you are." Ava's expression softened slightly. "But sorry isn't enough, because this isn't just about one comment at one event. It's about a pattern. It's about the way you've treated our relationship from the beginning. What do you mean? You never asked about my work, Jacob. Not really. You'd ask, how was your day? And I'd say, fine. And you'd move on. You never wanted to know what cases I was working on, what challenges I was facing, what I was proud of. You never asked because you assumed my work was smaller than yours, less important, less worthy of attention. Jacob felt something crack inside him because she was right. He'd been so consumed with his own career that he'd treated Ava's professional life as background noise, something polite to acknowledge but not genuinely engage with. And it's not just work, Ava continued. You made assumptions about everything. You assumed I didn't understand corporate culture because I didn't perform the way you did. You assumed I was content staying in the background because I didn't seek attention. You assumed my quietness meant I had nothing significant to say. You built an entire image of who I was based on your own insecurities, and you never bothered to check if that image was accurate. You're right. Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper. I did all of that, and I don't know how to fix it. You start by asking questions, Ava said simply. You start by listening. You start by treating me like someone whose inner life is as complex and important as your own. You start by understanding that my value isn't determined by how I reflect on you. Jacob nodded, tears streaming down his face now. I can do that. I want to do that. Maybe. Ava looked at him steadily. But wanting to change and actually changing are different things, Jacob. And I need to see real transformation, not just apologies and promises. I need to see you confronting the insecurity that drives you to treat people as props. I need to see you building a sense of self-worth that doesn't depend on external validation. I need to see you become someone who values integrity more than image. How long will that take? I don't know. Months. Maybe longer. She paused. And I need to be clear about something. I'm not going to wait forever. I'm not going to put my life on hold while you figure out how to be a decent person. If you can't do this work, if you can't fundamentally change who you are, then this marriage is over. The words hit Jacob like a verdict. Not cruel, not angry, just honest. I understand, he said. Do you? Ava leaned forward slightly. Because I'm not talking about couples, counseling and date nights and romantic gestures. I'm talking about you going to therapy and confronting the childhood trauma that makes you equate perception with worth. I'm talking about you rebuilding your entire value system from the ground up. I'm talking about transformation that's painful and humbling and takes years. Are you willing to do that? Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in their entire relationship. He saw the strength in her posture, the clarity in her eyes, the dignity she'd maintained even when he'd tried to strip it away. He saw everything he'd been too insecure to see before, and he made a choice. Yes, he said. I'm willing. Then prove it. Is less than break time equals 85 seconds? Is greater than is less than break time equals 85 seconds? Is greater than is less than break time equals 85 seconds? Is greater than is less than break time equals 85 seconds? Is greater than... Jacob started therapy the following week. He found a psychologist who specialized in self-worth issues and family of origin trauma, a middle-aged man named Dr. Raymond who worked out of a small office in Park Slope. The space was unpretentious, plants on the windowsill, worn furniture, shelves full of books, and Dr. Raymond himself had the kind of calm presence that made it impossible to perform, which was exactly what Jacob needed. Tell me why you're here, Dr. Raymond said during their first session. Jacob had prepared an answer, something articulate and self-aware, about wanting to improve his marriage and address his insecurities. But sitting in that quiet office, looking at Dr. Raymond's patient, non-judgmental expression, the prepared answer felt hollow. So instead, Jacob told the truth. I destroyed my marriage because I was too insecure to let my wife be herself, and I don't know how to be a person who doesn't do that. Dr. Raymond nodded slowly. That's a good place to start. The sessions were brutal. Not because Dr. Raymond was harsh, he wasn't. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in understanding Jacob's experience. But the process of unpacking why Jacob had developed such a profound belief that his worth was tied to perception, why he'd spent his entire adult life chasing an image of success instead of actual fulfillment, why he'd been willing to sacrifice his wife's dignity to protect his fragile sense of belonging. All of it required Jacob to confront parts of himself he'd been avoiding for decades. They talked about his childhood, about growing up poor and watching people dismiss his family, about the way his father's instability had taught him that security came from looking successful rather than being successful, about how watching his mother work herself to exhaustion while still being treated as lesser had convinced him that dignity was something you performed rather than something inherent. They talked about his relationship with Ava, about how he'd been drawn to her calm confidence because it was everything he wasn't, but how that same confidence had threatened him once he started imagining his future, about how he'd needed her to be smaller than she was because her actual size made him feel inadequate. "You were competing with your wife," Dr. Raymond observed during their 4th session. "Not consciously, maybe, but you saw her success as a threat to yours." "I did," Jacob admitted. "I thought there was only so much validation available, and if she had it, that meant less for me. And now," Jacob was quiet for a long moment, "now I realize validation was never the point. The point was respecting each other, and I failed at that completely." The work was slow, painful. There were sessions where Jacob left Dr. Raymond's office feeling worse than when he'd arrived, his carefully constructed self-image completely dismantled with nothing yet built to replace it. But he kept going, because Ava had asked him to prove he could change, and this was the only way he knew how. At work, the consequences continued to unfold. Jacob completed his performance improvement plan technically successfully. He attended all required meetings, completed all assigned training, met with his conduct advisor every week without complaint. But the professional damage was irreversible. He was removed from a major project he'd been leading. A junior consultant was promoted to a role he'd been promised. Invitations to client meetings stopped arriving. His name was quietly removed from the list of people being considered for promotion. None of it was official punishment. None of it violated company policy. But everyone understood what was happening. Jacob Silver was being managed out. He could have fought it, could have complained to HR, claimed discrimination, argued that he'd completed his improvement plan and deserved another chance. But he didn't, because Dr. Raymond had asked him a question that changed everything. "What do you actually want from your career?" And Jacob realized he didn't know anymore. For years, he'd wanted success, promotions, recognition, status, the feeling of belonging in rooms where important decisions were made. But now, sitting in therapy and confronting the cost of that ambition, he wasn't sure any of it had ever actually mattered. He'd achieved success at Hawthorne Global. He'd made it to the Gala, networked with senior partners, positioned himself for promotion, and it had felt empty the moment he'd achieved it, because he'd sacrificed something more important to get there. "Maybe I don't want to work at Hawthorne Global anymore," Jacob told Dr. Raymond during their 8th session. "Why not?" "Because staying here means constantly being reminded of what I did. Because every person I pass in the hallway knows I humiliated my wife. Because I can't rebuild myself while working in a place that represents everything I'm trying to change about who I am." "So what do you want instead?" Jacob didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in his adult life, he was willing to sit with the not knowing instead of rushing to fill the space with performance. Ava and Jacob saw each other once a week during this period. They met for dinner at neutral locations, restaurants in neighborhoods neither of them frequented, where they could talk without running into colleagues or neighbors. The conversations were careful, honest, and often uncomfortable. Ava asked questions Jacob had never considered before. "What do you value most in life? When was the last time you felt genuinely proud of yourself for something that had nothing to do with work? If no one was watching, who would you be?" Jacob struggled with the answers. He'd spent so long performing that he didn't know what authenticity looked like anymore. But he tried. He told Ava about therapy, about the painful realizations he was having, about the way Dr. Raymond was helping him understand the difference between self-worth and external validation. He admitted he didn't know how to rebuild himself, but that he was committed to the process. Ava listened carefully. She didn't offer easy reassurance. She didn't say everything would be okay. She just listened, asked follow-up questions, and occasionally shared her own reflections. "I'm proud of you for doing this work," she said during one of their dinners. "I mean that genuinely. This is hard, and you're not running from it." "It doesn't feel like enough," Jacob admitted. "It's not about enough or not enough," Ava said. "It's about whether you're becoming someone who can be in a healthy partnership, and that's not something I can determine yet." "Are you seeing anyone else?" Jacob asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded possessive, jealous, exactly the kind of thing the old Jacob would have asked, but Ava's expression softened slightly. "No, I'm not interested in dating right now. I'm focused on my work and figuring out what I need from my life." "Okay. But Jacob," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I need you to understand that even if you do this work, even if you transform completely, there's no guarantee I'll want to stay married to you. This isn't a transaction. You're not earning your way back into my good graces. You're becoming a better person, because that's what you should do regardless of whether I stay." The words stung, but Jacob knew they were true. "I understand," he said, and he did. For the first time in his life, Jacob was doing something difficult without a guaranteed payoff. He was changing because it was the right thing to do, not because it would get him what he wanted. It was terrifying. It was also the most honest work he'd ever done. 6 months after the gala, Ava was thriving. Her role as Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Hawthorne Global had proven to be exactly what she'd hoped for: challenging, meaningful, and positioned at the intersection of business strategy and social responsibility. She'd implemented new training programs, revised the company's supplier ethics standards, and established an anonymous reporting system for employees to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Richard Hawthorne praised her work publicly and often. Her team respected her. Industry publications wrote articles about Hawthorne Global's transformation under her leadership. Ava had stepped fully into her power, and it turned out that power looked like exactly what she'd always been: competent, principled, and deeply committed to treating people with dignity. She'd also moved out of the Brooklyn apartment she'd shared with Jacob. Not dramatically, there was no fight, no heated argument, no throwing of belongings. She simply told him, calmly and clearly, that she needed her own space while they figured things out. She rented a studio in Manhattan, close to Hawthorne Global's offices, and created a life that was entirely hers. Some evenings, she missed Jacob. She missed the early days of their relationship, before insecurity had poisoned everything, when they'd walked along Lake Michigan and talked about their hopes for the future. She missed the version of Jacob who'd been curious and ambitious and genuinely kind, before fear had twisted those qualities into something destructive. But she didn't miss the marriage they'd had, because that marriage had required her to be smaller than she was. It had required her to downplay her accomplishments, to manage Jacob's insecurity, to perform contentment with being underestimated, and Ava was done performing. Jacob, meanwhile, had made his own changes. After 9 months at Hawthorne Global following the gala, he submitted his resignation, not because he was forced out, though the writing was on the wall, but because he'd realized he needed to leave in order to rebuild himself. He took a job at a small non-profit in Brooklyn that helped low-income families access legal and financial services. The pay was a fraction of what he'd earned at Hawthorne Global. The work was unglamorous. There were no galas, no promotions to chase, no senior partners to impress. But it was real. Jacob worked directly with people who needed help: immigrants navigating bureaucracy, families facing eviction, workers dealing with wage theft. The problems were complex and often frustrating, but they mattered in a tangible, immediate way that his corporate work never had. And slowly, Jacob began to understand what Ava had known all along: that dignity didn't come from perception. It came from treating people, including yourself, with basic human respect. He continued therapy. He rebuilt his relationship with his parents, having honest conversations about his childhood and the ways his upbringing had shaped his insecurities. He started volunteering at the legal clinic where he and Ava had met years ago, doing the work he'd once dismissed as too messy and difficult. He became, gradually and imperfectly, a better person, but he still didn't know if it would be enough. On a cold evening in March, Ava texted Jacob asking if they could meet. They'd maintained their weekly dinners throughout the separation, and the conversations had become more relaxed over time. Jacob had stopped performing, stopped trying to convince Ava he'd changed, and simply showed up as himself, uncertain, flawed, genuinely trying. They met at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, the kind of place with red checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles, and food that reminded Jacob of the pizza place his parents used to take him to in Cleveland. Ava looked beautiful, as always professional, but relaxed, wearing jeans and a simple blouse instead of the formal work attire she usually wore. She smiled when she saw him, and Jacob felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months: hope. They ordered wine and pasta and talked about their weeks. Ava shared a story about a difficult meeting with a department head who'd been resistant to her ethics initiatives. Jacob told her about a case at the non-profit involving a family facing foreclosure that he'd been able to help resolve. The conversation was easy, familiar, like the early days of their relationship, before everything had gotten complicated. Then Ava set down her fork and looked at him directly. "I've been thinking," she said. Jacob's heart started pounding. This was it, the moment where she would tell him whether she wanted to stay married or move forward with divorce. Everything he'd worked for, all the therapy and self-reflection and painful transformation, had led to this conversation. "I've been thinking about what I need from a partnership," Ava continued, "and I've realized that what I need most is someone who sees me, not someone who celebrates me or puts me on a pedestal or even agrees with me all the time. Just someone who sees me as I actually am and respects what they see." "I see you," Jacob said quietly. "I finally see you, Ava, and I'm so sorry it took me so long." Ava nodded slowly. "I believe you. I can see the work you've done. I can see that you're different than you were a year ago. So, what does that mean for us?" Ava was quiet for a long moment, and Jacob felt like his entire future was balanced on the edge of whatever she would say next. "It means," she said finally, "that I'm willing to try again, slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and honest communication and the understanding that we're starting over, not picking up where we left off." Relief flooded through Jacob so intensely he felt dizzy. "Thank you, God. Ava, thank you. But," she interrupted gently, "I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I think you've earned it, or because I'm obligated to give you another chance. I'm doing this because I still love you, and because I believe people can change if they genuinely commit to it, and because I want to see if we can build something better than what we had before." "We can," Jacob said fervently. "I promise we can." "Don't promise," Ava said. "Just show up, be honest, do the work, and we'll see what happens." Jacob nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Okay, I can do that." They finished dinner talking about logistics. Ava would keep her Manhattan studio for now. They'd see each other twice a week. They'd continue couples counseling in addition to Jacob's individual therapy. Everything would be slow, deliberate, with no assumptions about the outcome. But for the first time since the gala, Jacob felt like he had a future worth working toward. 2 years later, Jacob and Ava renewed their vows. Not in a grand ceremony, neither of them wanted that. Just a small gathering in Prospect Park, surrounded by Ava's family and the few friends who'd supported them through the separation and rebuilding. No fancy clothes, no elaborate production, just honest words about who they'd become and what they wanted to build together. Jacob's vows were simple. "I promise to see you. I promise to respect you. I promise to value your dignity above my image, your truth above my comfort, your humanity above my ambition. I promise to keep doing the work of being someone worthy of your partnership. And I promise that if I ever fall short of these promises, I'll own it immediately and do better." Ava's vows were equally straightforward. "I promise to hold you accountable. I promise to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. I promise to support your growth without managing your emotions. I promise to stay as long as our partnership feels honest and mutual. And I promise that I will never again make myself smaller to make you feel bigger." Their families cried, their friends applauded, and Jacob and Ava began their marriage again this time, on terms that honored both of them. By the time Jacob was 38, his life looked nothing like what he'd imagined at 25. He was still working at the non-profit, now as a director overseeing several programs. He made a quarter of what his former colleagues at Hawthorne Global earned, but the work fulfilled him in ways corporate consulting never had. He'd published articles about economic justice and community-based legal services. He'd built genuine relationships with colleagues who respected him for his competence and integrity rather than his image. And he'd learned to measure success not by titles or recognition, but by whether he could look at himself in the mirror and feel proud of who he was. Ava had continued rising at Hawthorne Global, eventually becoming Chief Operating Officer, the second highest position in the company. She'd transformed the organization's culture, making it a model for ethical corporate leadership. She spoke at conferences, served on boards, and used her platform to advocate for systemic change in how businesses treated employees and communities. She'd become exactly who she'd always been capable of being: powerful, principled, and deeply respected. And she'd done it all without needing anyone's permission. On the 5-year anniversary of the Gala, the night that had destroyed and ultimately rebuilt their marriage, Jacob and Ava went back to the Plaza Hotel, not for an event, just for dinner at the hotel restaurant, a private commemoration of how far they'd come. They sat at a quiet table overlooking Fifth Avenue, the same building where Jacob had once made the worst decision of his life, and they talked about everything they'd learned. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked. "Giving me another chance?" Ava considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would look like if I'd walked away completely. Whether I'd be happier, more free, less complicated." She paused. "But no, I don't regret it, because what we have now is better than what most people ever build. It's honest, it's mutual, it's a partnership between equals." "I'm grateful every day," Jacob said quietly. "I'm grateful you believed I could change. I'm grateful you held me accountable. I'm grateful you never settled for less than you deserved. I'm grateful you did the work," Ava replied. "A lot of people wouldn't have. They would have made excuses, blamed circumstances, convinced themselves they were fine the way they were. But you didn't. You confronted the ugliest parts of yourself and changed them. That takes real courage." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the evening lights of Manhattan reflect off the hotel's glass. "Do you think we would have made it if the Gala hadn't happened?" Jacob asked. "No," Ava said immediately. "We would have limped along for a few more years, getting more disconnected, more resentful, until we either divorced or settled into one of those marriages where people stay together but don't really like each other. So in a twisted way, humiliating you at that Gala saved our marriage." Ava laughed, a real, genuine laugh that made Jacob's heart lift. "I wouldn't put it quite like that, but yes, in a way. Sometimes things have to break completely before they can be rebuilt properly. I'm sorry I had to break us first." "I know." Ava reached across the table and took his hand. "But we're not broken anymore." And they weren't. They were something different now, not the naive couple who'd gotten married believing love was enough, not the broken partnership that had nearly destroyed both of them, but something rebuilt from shared honesty, mutual respect, and the hard-won understanding that dignity wasn't something you performed. It was something you protected in yourself and in the people you loved. The story of Jacob and Ava Silver doesn't have a neat ending because life doesn't work that way. They continued doing the work of partnership, having difficult conversations, attending therapy, holding each other accountable, celebrating each other's successes without competition or insecurity. Some days were easy, some days were hard, but they showed up for each other honestly, which turned out to be the only thing that really mattered. Jacob never forgot what he'd done at that Gala. The memory remained sharp, a reminder of who he never wanted to be again. But he also learned to forgive himself, not to excuse his behavior, but to accept that people can commit terrible acts and still choose to become better. Ava never forgot either, but she learned that forgiveness didn't require forgetting. It required accountability, transformation, and the willingness to build something new, rather than trying to restore something that had never been healthy in the first place. And together, they proved something important. That power without permission is the truest kind of power. That dignity isn't negotiable, regardless of who's watching. That respect isn't something you earn through performance, it's something you give freely or not at all. and that the people who try to make you invisible are usually the ones who can't see themselves clearly. This was never a story about a man being embarrassed at a party. It was a story about what happens when you mistake performance for authenticity, when you value image over integrity, when you try to make someone smaller because you're afraid of your own insignificance. It was a story about cruelty born from insecurity, about revelation born from consequence, about transformation that's only possible when you stop running from who you've been and start building who you want to become. And it was a story about a woman who never needed anyone's permission to be powerful, who simply waited for the moment when her power could no longer be denied. That moment came, and when it did, it changed everything. The end.